You think the hardest part of being a bounty hunter in the Wild West was the shootout? You think it was the high noon duel or tracking a bandit through miles of hostile canyon territory? You're wrong. The shooting was the easy part. The real nightmare began the moment the smoke cleared and the target hit the dirt. 'Cause here's the thing about the biological reality of death that Hollywood completely ignores. A human body in the scorching Arizona heat doesn't just lie there peacefully. It becomes a ticking biological time bomb. And if you wanted to get paid, you had to drag that bomb 300 miles back to civilization without it exploding into a soup of rot and disease. Yeah, you heard that right. The bounty system wasn't built on trust. It was built on cold, hard proof. Dead or alive usually meant dead, but the sheriff didn't care about your word. He needed a body. He needed a face that the town undertaker or a witness could identify. But the biology of the frontier was fighting against you every single second. The moment a heart stops beating in 100-degree heat, the body's internal cooling system shuts down. Enzymes that used to digest your lunch start digesting you. Bacteria in the gut, which were helpful 10 minutes ago, suddenly realize there's no security system left and throw a massive party. Within 4 hours, rigor mortis sets in. Within 12 hours, in the direct sun, bloating begins. The gases build up. The smell attracts screwworm flies from miles away. Bounty hunters figured this out the hard way. Imagine tying a 200-pound corpse to the back of your horse. Horses, by the way, are terrified of the smell of death. They panic. They buck. So now you're fighting your own mount, fighting the flies, and fighting the nausea, all while your payday is literally melting onto your saddle. Most rookie hunters chose speed, thinking they could outrun the rot. Bad choice. By the time they reached the sheriff's office 3 days later, the proof was unrecognizable. No face, no reward, just a furious sheriff and a shovel. Smart hunters realized they needed to become amateur morticians fast, or they'd starve. So, what do you do when your cargo's too heavy and rotting too fast? You make the cargo smaller. This is the part of history books that usually gets skipped over because it's absolutely stomach-turning. Bounty hunters faced a brutal calculation. A whole body is heavy, hard to balance, and rots from the gut outward. The solution? Decapitation. It sounds barbaric, and it was, but it was purely logistical. A head fits in a saddlebag. A head contains the face, which is the only receipt the government cared about. But simply hacking off a trophy wasn't enough. A severed head in a leather bag sitting in the sun is going to become a horror show within hours. Hunters tried to wrap them in cloth or bury them deep in their gear, hoping to stifle the smell. It didn't work. The gases would expand. The soft tissues would liquefy. You'd open that bag a day later and find, well, let's just say you wouldn't find a face recognizable enough to claim a $500 reward. The headhunters, a term that got literal very quickly, needed a way to stop nature from taking its course. They needed preservatives. And just like pirates needed to keep their water from turning green, cowboys needed to keep their proof from turning black. Here's where the irony gets rich. The techniques bounty hunters used to preserve human proof were the exact same ones they used to preserve their dinner. Salt became more valuable than ammunition. A smart hunter never rode out without a massive sack of coarse rock salt. Not for cooking, but for curing. When a target was taken down, the process had to be immediate. If they were taking the head, they would treat it exactly like a ham. They'd pack the ears, the nose, and the mouth with salt. They'd rub it into the skin until it formed a crust. The science here is actually pretty sound. Salt draws moisture out of cells. Bacteria need moisture to survive and multiply. No water, no bacterial party, no rot. It's osmosis weaponized for profit. Some accounts from the frontier describe hunters essentially jerkying their evidence. They would let the sun and wind dry out the salted skin until it was leathery and tough. It looked grotesque. Faces would shrink, lips would pull back, but the features remained intact enough for identification. But there was a catch. Salt requires a lot of volume to be effective. If you missed a spot, or if the salt layers shifted during a rough ride, the rot would start underneath the crust. You'd end up with a hard shell containing a liquefied center. When that shell cracked, game over. And let's be honest, carrying a sack of salt big enough to cure a whole outlaw was heavy. If you were chasing the Dalton gang, you couldn't carry a mobile salt mine with you. They needed something liquid, something that could penetrate deep into the tissue. This is where the cowboy and the pirate overlap in their survival chemistry. Alcohol. We've all seen the movie scene where the cowboy pours whiskey on a gunshot wound to sterilize it. Well, take that logic and scale it up. Wealthier bounty hunters, or those who had just collected a down payment, would resort to pickling. If they killed a notorious outlaw, a man whose face was worth thousands, they couldn't risk the salt method failing. They would procure a barrel, not a water barrel, but a tight-sealed spirit barrel. They'd stuff the evidence inside and fill it to the brim with the cheapest, strongest, high-proof alcohol they could find, usually whiskey, sometimes rum, or even pure grain alcohol if they were near a mining camp supply store. The alcohol acted as a fixative. It killed the bacteria instantly and chemically froze the tissue in place. It was basically a low-budget version of the formaldehyde jars you see in science labs today. There are records of the man in the barrel being transported by wagon for weeks. The alcohol kept the face looking almost peaceful, aside from the fact that it was floating in booze. But here's the weird part. This method created a bizarre economic dilemma. Whiskey on the frontier was expensive. Sometimes the cost of the alcohol needed to preserve the head was almost as high as the bounty itself. You had hunters doing mental math over a corpse. Is this guy worth 10 gallons of good rye? And then there was the temptation. You're 3 weeks on the trail. You're out of water. You're thirsty. And you have a barrel full of liquid right there. Sure, it has a head floating in it, but alcohol is alcohol, right? Disgusting? Yes. Did it happen? Absolutely. Desperate men did desperate things. The phrase rot gut whiskey might have a more literal origin than you want to think about. When salt was gone and the whiskey was for drinking, hunters turned to the fire. Just like pirates charmed their water barrels to filter out impurities, bounty hunters used charcoal to manage the smell and slow the decay. It wasn't as effective as pickling, but it was better than nothing. They would take wood ash and crushed charcoal from their campfires and pack it around the body or the head. Carbon is incredible at absorbing odors and toxins. It acted as a desiccant, sucking up moisture and trapping the gases that alerted every vulture in the county. It was a messy, filthy job. By the time they arrived in town, the hunter was covered in soot, and the proof looked like a blackened statue. The local coroner would have to wash off the ash to verify the identity. But this technique had a massive flaw. It was surface level only. While the outside was dry and odorless, the inside was still rotting. It was a race against time. The charcoal bought you maybe an extra day or two. If your horse threw a shoe or you got pinned down by a storm, that charcoal packing would fail catastrophically. The smartest hunters started combining methods. Salt the flesh, wrap it in charcoal-dusted canvas, and keep it moving at night when the air was cooler. They became experts in thermodynamics without ever opening a physics book. But all these methods, the salt, the whiskey, the ash, were medieval solutions to a modern problem. They were messy, unreliable, and frankly, traumatizing. Then technology arrived on the frontier and changed the bounty hunting game forever. The camera. You might think photography was just for portraits, but for bounty hunters, it was the ultimate distillation of their job. Why drag a 200-pound rotting carcass across the desert when you could just capture the light bouncing off its face? This was the birth of post-mortem photography as a business tool. Proving a kill used to require the meat. Now, it just required a plate. But here's the catch. Early cameras were massive, heavy wooden boxes with fragile glass plates and dangerous chemicals. A bounty hunter couldn't just keep a Kodak in his pocket. This led to a weird new ritual. When a gang was taken down, the hunters wouldn't immediately transport the bodies. They would transport the photographer. They'd ride to the nearest town, grab the local picture taker, and drag him out to the site of the kill. Or they would prop the bodies up. You've seen those old photos of the Dalton gang or Jesse James laid out on boards. Those aren't just news photos. Those are receipts. They would prop the corpses up against walls, open their eyes, sometimes using toothpicks or tape, and pose them with their guns. It wasn't just for dramatic flair. It was to make them look identifiable. The camera allowed hunters to capture the proof before the rot set in. Once the photo was developed, the body could be buried right there in Boot Hill. The hunter didn't need the head. He needed the picture. As the West got tamed, the logistics shifted again. The railroad brought something miraculous to the desert. Ice. Just as pirates collected sea ice in the north, bounty hunters began using the rail network to transport bodies on ice. The corpse train became a reality. If a bounty was huge, we're talking thousands of dollars, it was worth buying a ticket for the body. They would pack the outlaw in a coffin filled with sawdust and blocks of ice cut from frozen lakes in the mountains. The sawdust insulated the ice, keeping it frozen for days, even in the Texas heat. This allowed for the transport of the whole body in a relatively pristine condition. This was the VIP treatment of bounty hunting. If you saw a hunter loading a dripping wooden crate onto a train car, you knew he had just caught a big fish. It was a status symbol. I don't need salt or whiskey. I can afford ice. But with these preservation methods came a new problem. Fraud. When you bring in a salted, dried-out head that looks like a leather bag, or a body that's been bloated and then shrunk by alcohol, identification gets tricky. Unscrupulous hunters realized that a close enough resemblance was often all they needed. If a bandit had a mustache and a scar, and you found a drifter with a mustache and a scar, well, a little bit of decomposition could hide the differences. There are stories of hunters turning in heads that were accidentally damaged during transport, just enough to obscure the features, but preserved enough to claim the reward. The sheriff would look at the salted, battered face, shrug, and pay up. The preservation techniques that were meant to ensure justice were weaponized to cheat it. It got so bad that some agencies, like the Pinkertons, started demanding multiple forms of proof, witnesses, photos, and the body, to prevent counterfeit corpses. The weird part is, these desperate frontier experiments actually laid the groundwork for modern forensic science. Those hunters pouring whiskey into barrels weren't that far off from how we preserve tissue samples today. The photographers propping up bodies were the ancestors of crime scene photography. They learned about decomposition rates, insect activity, and the effects of temperature on the human body not because they were scientists, but because their paycheck depended on it. Today we have DNA and refrigerated vans. We have digital databases. But back then a bounty hunter had to be a tracker, a gunfighter, and a chemist all in one. So the next time you see a cool movie cowboy riding off into the sunset with a body slung over his horse, just remember what's actually happening. He's not thinking about justice. He's thinking about bacteria. He's worrying about the temperature, and he's praying that his sack of salt was big enough. Because in the Wild West, you didn't just have to be faster than the outlaw. You had to be faster than the rot. And that is the true disgusting reality of the frontier.